Hello everyone, welcome back to another MangaToon video. Let's get on with today's recap. This is the Jirlela Kingdom, and this story is about the sole heir to the kingdom's throne, Lagyr. At the prince's birth, a singer sang to deem him as the second coming of an angel. When people saw the pretty child of noble lineage, the blessed and celebrated his birth. Unfortunately, it did not last for too long. That the birth of the child was actually the start of a terrible disaster. As years passed, a servant was killed by a guard of the child, who was then reprimanded for not having killed him with enough brutality as a price for the sin of breaking his precious statue. Despite the frantic apologies, लाग्yr's anger did not subside, and he ordered the other of the pair to decapitate him instead. Desperate pleadings were ignored, and a blood-curdling scream escaped through the hallway. Lagyr remained silent for a while before glancing at the mutilated corpse beside him and smiling at it coldly. Another set of years later, he gleaned as a kneeling subordinate claimed that the magic book he had gifted him was capable of summoning a demon. A relatively swollen Lagyr was bedazzled at getting his hands on a magic book and cackled while expressing his grief, wishing the majestic demons would destroy the world. His silence makes the gifter consider his dislike towards the gift, what he denies, claiming his survival to be proof of the liking he had taken towards it. At लाग्yr's query, he states that since the presence of another person might disturb the summoning, a demon required one to truly desire its appearance, alongside pure spiritual ki. Conscious about his own safety, he sought to confirm if the summon would want to kill him, and with a sinister smile under his robe, the man proclaims that it wasn't even plausible. He was risking his life in an attempt to give him one of the forbidden magic books, which were quite literally forbidden by the kingdom's law. Lagyr demanded the man to keep it a secret, for if he dared to choose otherwise, he would kill him with his own hands. The vowing man had previously stated himself to be an archaeologist working in the ocean god's temple, and at the prince's query, further claimed his name to be Saul Harder. At a conclusive note, he sought Saul to return to his post, offering a bountiful reward if in case his contract with the said demon was a success. Dutifully, the cloaked one takes his leave, and after distancing himself a little bit, gleams with a sinister thought in mind. Meanwhile, Lagyr, the prince of the Jirlela Kingdom, was lost in his thoughts of summoning a demon. He was lost in the scent of power. He was lost in the thought of forming a contract with a demon. He was intrigued by the thought of materializing the myth of war. But as he started to laugh frantically, a shattering glass of wine interrupted him. He turned to find a distraught maid and inquired if she had heard him. Desperately to live, she fell to the ground to plead for the sin that deserved death. But Lagyr simply repeated her words, causing all emotions on her face to drain and commanding her to die. He unsheathed the blade, and blood spilled onto the castle walls as the obvious occurred. Strange letters were etched onto the brandished blade, and as the body fell limp, he threw the sheath away, disgusted at the blood that had stained his clothes. Unable to contain his anger, he started kicking at the corpse, before turning away to discard his blade and focus on summoning the demon instead. He flapped it open on a table, but discovers that all of the pages inside were empty. While he grows furious at the guts of the scammer, the blood on his hands seeps into the blank pages. An alarming crimson glow follows, and the pages started to flap around violently. It slowly came to a standstill, and Lagyr snapped back to reality, because the book levitated before him with a nefarious hue to itself. He exclaimed at the hint of success, before reaching out to it and seeking the demon to bestow him, Lagyr Lu Jirlela Rodwill, a supreme power. Having voiced his ultimatum, he cackled viciously and demands the dominance of Jirlela on the entire world, but unbeknownst to him, a trail of blood trickles down his nose. He was baffled by the sudden nosebleed that followed with a sudden slip in his consciousness. He grabbed his nose and bled alongside his eyes, and wailed in horror of the unannounced harm he had brought to himself. As he fell to the ground, the blood coiled around the book, and soon, a dark energy clouded the entire room, following which the silhouette of a demon appeared out of the forbidden book summoned by the Book of Lagyr. A rigid voice was stupefied by the darkness, and the only possible answer its owner could think of was the circle of summoning. He, the Demon King, was curious about the identity of the one who had dared to summon him, because it was out of curiosity that he had answered. However, whatever happened next was unknown to him. His eyes opened in a foreign establishment, debating if the contract had failed. Mysteriously, he, the Demon King, was profusely sweating, and while his hands resembled a pig's, the huge stomach below answered that it was the body of his contract agent. He pinched his huge bulging under-chin while seated on a chair and recounted the details of the contract. The name of the contractor was Lager Lu Jurlela Rodwill, who died during the contract and lost his body of soul, implying that it was the infamous event of possession. Even the demon lord failed to fathom why he had died right after making the contract and deduced that he was unable to handle it, making his summoning even more questionable. As his memories kick in, he learns that it was because he was the sole prince with the blessings of the ocean god, making him an individual worthy of summoning someone like him. After succeeding in summoning him, the Lagier failed to withstand his powerful magic, eventually choked on his own blood, and died like a pathetic weakling. Despite his death, the contracted one had to fulfill the contract, and as such, he was to unfortunately live in the body until the requisites were fulfilled. His name was Embulden, the kind demon king, who was now incentivized to have a tour of the human world under the guise of the contract. He nodded with a newfound resolution that recounted the details of the contract while pacing the room. Foremost, grant immense power to the pathetic pig of a prince, PPP, and secondly, make the Jurleas rule the world. Embulden was baffled at how Lager had even managed 2 different wishes in such a short period of time, and sat down while cursing at the greedy hog. At least he tried to, because the legs gave in to the massive weight, and the demon lord descended. Disregarding the contract, his first priority was to lose weight. Moments later, a loudish spread arrived on the table, and before the dumbfounded Embulden, or to rephrase myself, Lager. Reasonably, he asked if he was to eat all of it, and the butler, terrified of the original Lager, trembled to state that it was for his health. Embulden was grateful because they assumed the maid to have attempted to poison him, and the demon prayed that it wasn't prepared for him to die of overeating. He ordered the desperate attendant to take it away and expressed his dislike at repeating himself. In a flurry, maids hurry to clear the table, and as Lager announces his resolution to exercise the following day, the butler was left bewildered, for he was renowned for even struggling to breathe. While staring at the ceiling, Embulden lay on the bed, annoyed by the bothersome fat. Although an idea clicked in his mind, he refrained from using magic to get rid of it in order to uphold the contract. 1, he was to only use magic to fulfill the contract requests, and 2, as a demon king, it would hurt his pride to feel defeated by the mere likes of fatness. Furthermore, if he was caught using magic, he would fail to return to hell by becoming the first demon king who died as a human. He needed to fulfill the contract quickly, and recognized his need for a servant. The answer, Te Thanatos, although an annoyance because of his talkative nature, he did not yet have the luxury of choice. Biting his finger, he spilled a little blood to invoke the spell of familiar summon. A black smog floods the room, and a pair of monstrous eyelids part to glare at the summoner. Lager called for his servant, and a blinding light pierced a demonic gateway, causing the entire room of the prince to turn into a mess. Forced to sit on his bed by the sudden winds, he finds a little swell under the sheet. Angered at the disobedience of Te, he snatches the sheets away, only to discover a little black lizard mooling at him. Although Embulden tried to call for it, the tiny one screeched at the guts of the seeming human to summon him, a demon dragon. Past his smile, Embulden's anger was growing at its insolence, but it was endgame when it mocked him as a fusion of a pig and a human. He started emanating a tinge of his demonic aura, amidst which the little one sensed a familiarity from his eyes. It snapped, and it timidly asked if he was his king. As he attests, Te starts to wail and recount that it had desperately searched for him everywhere, before leaping and hurling endless questions of concern at him, who reconsidered his decision of summoning the noisy one. Te could already tell that it was a substitute contract, and even took pride in it bashfully as the king's servant. However, when he asked about the brat's wishes, he was reprimanded for speaking carelessly. Apologetically, he politely requested to learn of his contractor's wishes, and with a scowl, Embulden states his desire for a power above anyone else. However, with the presence of the demon king had already completed that, and reasonably, Te was confused. At this, his lord revealed the second wish of the pig, for his country to rule the world, which was yet another surprise for the dragon, because a demon's contract only offered 1 wish per soul. At his liege's inquiry, he claims it to have been decided by the first demon Aaron, and although Lager simply sighed at it, Te was alarmed considering something impossible to have happened to his original body. But Embulden, not quite as much. Te deemed it to be his lord's unwavering composure, who subtly ignored the serious topic to wonder about his humane weight loss. Having been born as a part of the demon dragon's bloodline, Te had received all the knowledge of his predecessors, indicating that he was knowledgeable about the human world as well. Now Tay disregarded the weight loss, deeming his form to be plenty beautiful, and was reminded about the pig-human fusion term he had just spouted. Summarizing the need for a human to eat less and exercise, the little one floats around, already aware of those, and Bilden emphasizes his need for something more instantaneous, and something clicks in the mind of Tay, who then proposed the option of swordsmanship and reading as a form of training. While swordsmanship was impossible with this body, he was baffled by the proposal of reading, that Tay reasons to be a form of expending energy at a mental level. Moving on, Bilden decides to formulate his plans for the second wish through humane methods and orders Tay to control his diet in the meanwhile. However, when the little one mentions the inconvenient form of his, a servant comes knocking at the door. Parting the wooden doors, an attendant appears, assuming his lord to be asleep. Lager immediately creeps behind him, inquiring about his name, and the scared one runs behind the door. As he repeats himself, the servant kneels, stating that he was yet to receive one from him, his lord. Bilden confirms the trembling one's reply and smiles before speaking the name of Tay. The confused one raises his head, and his lord announces that his name henceforth would be Tay. Lager's red eyes alarmed the servant, but the demon king commanded his demon dragon Tay to devour him. The poor one looks up with terrified eyes, and the form of a sinister dragon appears to devour him. The next morning was bright, and Lager walked past the royal corridors with a humane Tay at his side. The demon dragon was elated to serve him, and affirms that he was capable enough to even adjust into an angel's body. At his lord's command to hide his flapping tail, he magically retracts his wriggling tail, and beams at having successfully followed his lord's command, who asks about how long it would take him to reach the training grounds. The answer was a neighing horse, but the stableman was concerned whether he would be able to get on it. He could tell that the man was directly announcing his fatness to be a literal burden, and although infuriated, Bilden could not deny it after imagining the aftermath himself. Tay obediently offers to assist him, but he declares his decision to walk there by himself. The trees were swaying in the morning breeze, while a princely leg trembled under its sweating owner's massive weight. They were treading through an inclined trail, and although Tay requests him to refrain from walking, he intimidatingly imposes his decision, making the dragon timidly agree. Although he was angered enough to smash Lager in the face, his eyes suddenly started to lose focus. The beautiful white eyelids shut on the blue eyes below, and the demon king Bilden fainted, startling Tay, who rushes to call for his lord. Hours later, he regains consciousness in his chambers, berating his horrible stamina on top of his ugly appearance. Finding his lord awake, Tay relays the doctor's recommendation for him to rest and hydrate himself, but Bilden was far from giving up, because he was the demon king of hell, who vowed to make it to the training grounds by himself. After a month passed, he was soon panting at the trail, but now he was congratulated for finally being able to walk for 3 hours straight. His number of chins had fallen from 3 to 2, and even Tay had grown completely used to his new body. Both of them were worried about what had happened to the demon realm in his absence, and Tay assumed it to have already turned into complete chaos. Reasonably, Lager was angered and curious as to how he could tell that, and he timidly claimed it to have already turned terrible after he had gone missing. Although it had been just a month, time in the demon realm passed much faster. At his inquiry, Tay deems the dimensions to be extremely distant from each other, and as realization dawns on the king, his servant summarized a day in the human realm to be equivalent to 10 days in the demon world, if not a month. Bilden now realized that he would be away from hell for a long time because of the contract, and although he was certain that the kingdom would not collapse, the thought of heaven's invasion made him uncertain. Calling out to Tay, he relayed his decision to complete the contract and return to hell as soon as possible. Days later, the scenery of the forest is followed by the appearance of the Jurlela kingdom's flag and the trembling hands of Lager. He was finally standing on a moat, and 2 individuals came rushing at him from inside. He respectfully requests his reason of visiting the lowly place, and claimed to have prepared well after hearing the word of his arrival. He rushes to order his men to attend him, and moments later, he is seen quenching his thirst. As Tay wipes the sweat for him, the instructor requested about his reason. When Lager announces his need to increase his stamina, the man asks if something was amiss. His eyes squint in evident frustration, compelling the man to apologetically start on the preparations, and claims that even trained knights were unable to walk such a great distance. Appalled when Lager questions the claim, he stutters to elaborate that the knights were incompetent, but all in all the prince understood that it was a fake praise. He debated if the trainees weren't official knights yet, and although the captain claimed that his renowned identity would be accentuated with a bit of training, Embildon was aware of Legier's identity as the dancing pig. Words from someone like the captain were worthless, but when he offers to bring him some tea and bread, he rises from his seat and repeats to clarify that he had arrived there to increase his stamina instead of enjoying a tea party with his mustache. He left with Tay in tow, and while the cadets trained, they took notice of the unprecedented visit of the prince. While they bowed in respect, from the corner of his eyes, Legier glanced at a blonde, preoccupied one. The keen eyes of Embildon helped him notice that the blade in use was a single-edged one, and to top it all off, the swordsman didn't seem to care about the presence of the sole hair of the land. He couldn't help but smile, because he was amusing. At the same time, the swordsman closed his eyes and imagined an opponent before himself. As his eyes open, he lands a swift slash across its length, and voiced his resolution to never be defeated. Legier walks stepping on the mutilated dummy and denotes how he had followed his words and prevailed, while his crimson eyes make the victor flinch abruptly, but slowly it fades and the blue eyes return. The prince commends him, who could swear that his eyes had altered, but snapping back to reality, he bows as he recognizes who the owner of the unique blue eyes was. The captain appears apologizing and excusing the lack of manners of the commoner, and Legier questions the guts of a commoner to be in his majestic presence. Desperately, the captain identifies him as Huan Whale, the victor of the previous year's martial arts tournament, who was initially a commoner, but was later granted knighthood. The promotion intrigued the prince, who could now understand how the cadet could wield such a killing intent, having taken a liking to the amusing individual and assigned him the role of his teacher. Huan wondered if it was the infamous prince before him, and stated his uncertainty about his order. Legier then mentioned the sword perched at his waist, and the counterpart recognized the royal family's heirloom. Claiming it to be the renowned Kawa, he unsheathed the blade gilded with royal intricacies, and flaunting its beauty, stated that although he carried it around as a decoration, after the rumored assassination attempt in him, he was compelled to want to learn to use it properly. Denoting his little fatness, he aimed the blade at his throat, and as the captain grew frantic, repeated his assignment as the one in charge of helping him lose it. Huan did not speak initially, but claimed that he was neither qualified nor skilled enough to teach someone like him. Instead of a direct refusal, he claimed it to be just a request for him to find someone relatively worthy. When Legier demanded him to forget it instead, Huan was a little distraught since he usually started to rampage when denied and didn't back down. Now the prince claimed that it did not matter to Huan if the prince of his kingdom died by cholesterol or an ambush, or saved him the trouble of teaching him by being poisoned by the maid. As he sought his answer, Huan denied it outright, but failed to reply when Legier demanded him to speak honestly, if he had just silently wished for him to die. He reasoned his silence to be founded by his incompetency. However, when Legier questioned his skills, he clenched his teeth and tightened his fist. Conclusively, he reasoned his humble origins to be the cause, and heeding this, Legier proposed a duel to gauge and confirm if his skills were good enough to teach him. When Huan recounted his lack of swordsmanship skills, he stated that he would not be clashing against him. Instead, it would be his servant, that clueless Tay. Baffled, he inquired if he was the one doing it, and his lord threw him in the swordsmanship ditch, without a hitch. Equipped with a wooden blade, Huan stood in the training ground, with the clueless Tay before him. He swung his wooden blade, pondering why his lord abruptly hurled him to use the blade, and watching his swings, Huan denoted that he was relatively used to wielding a blade. The ever-cheerful Tay grew curious, while he reasoned that his fearless swingings were the answer. With a warm smile, he claimed to be only afraid of a single someone in the entire world, and as Huan discerned it to be his master, the prince, Tay saluted, to reason that he was his loyal servant. However, questioning his tone that indicated as if the prince wasn't his liege, he requested a handicap. As the captain announced the commencement, Tay closed in on his side and whacked the blade directly against Huan's. The assailant was startled to note that his left hand was folded behind his back and was a slight bit pissed that he, the demon dragon, was actually being faced with a single hand. Huan wasn't intent on going all out against someone who wasn't a knight, while Tay was similarly uninterested in going all out against someone who wasn't a demon. From behind him, the seated Legier silently watched the clash, and as a blow was lashed at Tay's cheek, he agilely jumped away. A slit on his cheek started to bleed, and Huan warned him against letting his guard down carelessly. Tending to the cut, Tay announces his resolution to focus on his master's wishes. Huan was startled once again as he rapidly closes in on him. However, he pounces into the air and smashes his blade against his with a threatening scream. Huan fluidly flicks his blade that makes the offensive one slip, and Tay is forced to stumble towards the ground. Having collapsed, he smiled while grabbing a handful of dirt and hurls it at Huan's eyes, who was further bewildered to find the wicked one closing in with his blade aimed for his throat. He hurriedly evaded it with a tilt and smashed his own blade against Tay's waist, who choked at the terrible impact but found Huan to be approaching with a downward draft. A wooden blade fell against the dirt, and Tay knelt, defeated. Captain Moustache was left gaping while the prince gleamed and announced the victory of Huan Whale. As evening set, the demonic pair was returning. Reasonably pained, Tay exclaimed at his aching shoulders, and evidently pissed. Leger demanded him to shut up. He could already tell that he was irritated by the lengthy walk back and voiced his amazement at the wonderful potential of the human swordsman he had witnessed after ages. After he had deflected his blade, he was unable to believe that he was a human, but pissed at his annoying chattering, Leger demanded him to shut up, and the teary dragon timidly complied. He heaved a sigh under the pressure of his body, and unable to walk anymore, he slumped to the ground. He questioned how calm Tay appeared after losing to a mere human, and turns out that he was happy to have forced the swordsman to use his handicap hand. Furthermore, as his lord had demanded of him, he had lost to the swordsman, and disregarding that, he could tell that his lord had already taken a liking to him. Leger attested to it, and Tay asked if the humanely strong Huan was strong enough to meet his demonic standards. He sought if he disliked him, and Tay reasoned that despite his good sense at that young age, he was an unrefined gem, and nothing noteworthy yet. That in itself implied that Leger would be burdened by the trouble of bringing out his actual potential, which made him regret the absence of another someone. His name was Rey Revito, the demon king Imbolden's blade, as well as his loyal dog, whom he trusted to have been maintaining the order back in his absence. In hell, Rey ranked the fourth, preceded by Tay at the third, and the second was Sinner Lucifer. He deemed Huan good enough to be the knight of the Prince Leger, because that guy was left-handed. Although initially confused by the odd mention, Tay was later bewildered, since he then recalled Huan Whale to have retracted his left hand when clashing against him. He now detested the arrogant human for daring to test him, and Leger simply smiled as he vowed to exact his revenge. Raising his head, he glanced at the setting sun of the human world, which appeared as if it was bleeding after being stabbed by a fragmented cloud. Well, then comes another day at the training grounds, and the look of confusion on Huan's face, because towering before him was the returned prince, inquiring if he had changed his mind yet. Huan was distressed because he was intent on it even after 4 days had passed, and the captain returned expressing his desperate concern for his reported sickness and loss of weight. Threateningly, he inquired about where he had specifically found him to have shrinked, but when the captain grew clueless, he repeated himself to demand about which part of his body he found to have lost fat. As he started to stutter, he urgently demanded him to immediately answer his query, and amidst his stutters, the captain claimed it to be his chin, fingers, and earlobes. Evidently pissed at the baseless answer, he demands clarification, and with a slight bend, he points at another location. As Leger follows where his finger pointed at, his gaze ends up at quite the unexpected answer. Frantic, he begs to claim otherwise, but is demanded to shut up and get out of his sight. As he scurries away, Huan affirmed that he could indeed witness the humiliation he was going through. Having proved his reason, Leger asked him to teach him how he was to lose fat quickly, and attests that it was his endgame all along into persuading him. Huan sighed, requesting him to have clarified it from the very beginning, indicating that he wasn't interested in the pretense of being his teacher, and instead get to the point. At this, Leger reasons that being a royalty, he was needed to have an official token of reason for everything he did, and at Huan's confusion, he elaborates. With the ton of attention he naturally drew because of his high position, he, the prince, was able to do everything regardless of any opposition. But one single thing lay as an exception. None of his followers followed him sincerely, indicating to Huan that he was seeking now him for that very token of reason. He seeks his agreement to become his teacher, and silence persists in the room amidst the three individuals. With yet another advent of a day at the royal castle, maids were busy dressing a rather sleek white-haired royalty, and he was graced with the royal blade named Kawa. This was the result after 5 months, where Leger found himself just too perfect. As the maids bowed at his leave, a hand pressed against a slender waist, while the other graced a beautiful smirk, because the sleek Leger now found his reflection a little too perfect, An inquisitive Tay suddenly appeared behind him, compelling him to excuse his moment of being preoccupied by himself, and when he almost guesses it, he demands him to shut up. He presented another decoration that he denied outright, despite the day being a significant one. As he emerged out of his room, a blonde individual stood guard that he turned to smile at. Huan Whale bowed as he walked away and silently stared back at his distancing back. He followed as Leger reminded him about how important the day was for him as well, and he politely conveyed his satisfaction with the simple outfit. Silently, Leger halted to face him, his blue eyes piercing him. 5 months ago, he had claimed that he wasn't intent on serving him. He had inquired if the position of being the prince's teacher wasn't to his liking, or if he wanted to hold some position even greater than that. Mentioning his humble beginning as a commoner, he explained that he had obtained his title by winning a competition and forged his way henceforth. However, neither titles nor the position of serving His Highness intrigued him, because he had an even greater ambition. When interrogated about that, he had claimed the position that led an army from the vanguard. He claimed the position of the great general. Back to the current timeline, Leger failed to understand how the ambitious one lacked the greed for such luxuries, but when he retorted claiming how he was one to speak, he emphasized his position as the superior that necessitated Huan to heed his orders, and he bowed to comply. Previously, Leger was taken aback by the mention of the significant position, but Huan had immediately apologized for overstepping. However, the problem was that the position of the great general was long gone, but despite the lack of chances of a war in the Jirlela kingdom, he intended to hold the position, further claiming to cross the ocean if he needed to obtain it by moving to another nation. He brought a smile across Leger's face. He chuckled at how blatantly he ignored his royalty, which confused Huan furthermore, who debated if the greedy one was also an intellectually challenged one. Switching to a serious tone, he stated that despite his intentions of betraying the country, he was uncertain if he considered being beheaded by testing his limits viable instead. His impudence to test him, the next king of the country, earned him the title of an insolent bastard, who shrieked at the intense bloodlust hurled at him. Although he would have been beheaded, this had now turned into an unfortunate incident. Huan had yet again seen the red glow in his eyes, but closing in on him, Leger asked if he knew about his goal. Placing his hand on his shoulder, he stared him directly in the eyes, and bringing his mouth close to his ears, spouted the words of world domination. Yet again back to the present time, a massive bell was clanging at the castle walls, and Tay deemed the bright day a perfect one for a festival. It was the start of the ritual for the ocean god that was held during fall when crops were harvested. The best harvest of the year was used as offerings for the ocean god, and at noon of the significant day, they put crops offerings on a massive ship to send to the ocean god. Furthermore, it was law of the Jirlela royalty to board the ship foremost. Indirectly, Leger discerned that he would be the one leading the job, and Tay giggled to state that being scared of getting on a ship, the prince had never taken up the role in the past. The goddess he wanted to meet was renowned to be a beautiful one, and Tay was naive enough to be intrigued to confirm the rumor. However, Huan had a serious pallor on his face. To raise an army in Jirlela, one was required to foremost get the permission of the ocean god, who was the one who oversaw the ocean that surrounded the kingdom. This specific year's ritual was important to gain the favor of the ocean god, and Huan was seeking the benefit of finding himself her support. In the case he could not, he needed to at least earn enough favor for an army to be able to cross the ocean on ships. Under the beaming sun, they stood at a silent establishment, where a servant relayed the news of a prepared carriage that was to take them to the harbor. However, Leger refused to call for Chan, and the terrified servant stuttered to follow. A pearl-white mane waved in the air, and Leger reached out with his hand to caress the snout of Can, his horse. The servant, or the stableman, was amazed at the disobedient horse's change when it came to Leger. Before he could proceed, Tay intercepted him, and a precious white robe fluttered in the air, before gracing the shoulders of the prince, who decided to take off. Tay smiled his usual cheerful one, and the Demon King, emboldened, reciprocated with a smile.